The deep rumble of the engines filled the cabin, a sound that to Andrew Morgan was pure music. At just 12 years old, the boy settled into the seat next to his mother, Claire, attentively watching the flight attendants and the unmistakable chimes signaling the fastening of seatbelts. His hands firmly gripped an aviation book, its worn pages revealing how many times he had read it. "Do you already know the model, Len?" Claire asked with a gentle smile, fully aware of her son's enthusiasm. Andrew glanced out the small oval window where the metal wings gleamed under the sunlight. "It's an Airbus A320, he answered without hesitation. "The engines are CFM56 5B4. It can carry about 180 passengers. We're in an economy configuration, so it's probably almost full." Claire shook her head, impressed. It wasn't surprising that he knew these details. Andrew spent hours on a flight simulator at home, diving into manuals and watching aviation videos. His room was decorated with posters of famous aircraft, and he had already amazed his teachers with essays on the subject. A flight attendant approached to check seatbelts. Andrew, as always, didn't miss the opportunity. "We're at gate 12, right? That means we'll take off from runway 09, heading east, correct?" He pointed out the window. "The wind seems to be in our favor, judging by how those palm trees are moving." The flight attendant, surprised, leaned in slightly. "That's right, kiddo. You sure know a lot for someone your age." He smiled shyly. "I read a lot about it. I think it's fascinating how it all works. Thrust control, airflow over the wings, the balance between lift and drag." The flight attendant chuckled softly. "Maybe you should apply for our Young Aviators program." She winked before moving on to the next row. Claire patted her son's shoulder. "You should have told her you already know more than half the pilots out there." Andrew laughed, but his eyes stayed glued to the window, where the plane was beginning to taxi. He felt the soft vibrations of movement and the engine's increasing hum, a reminder of the magnitude of what was about to happen. For him, flying was more than an experience. It was a connection, a passion he knew he would never abandon. As the aircraft waited for takeoff clearance, Andrew opened his book, his small but steady hands marking the pages. He was studying cockpit diagrams, memorizing buttons, levers, and warning lights. For Andrew, this wasn't a game, it was preparation. One day he would be a pilot, and every detail he learned now felt like a step closer to that dream. The plane sped down the runway, pressing everyone back into their seats. The deafening roar of the engines at full power brought a smile to Andrew's face. The landing gear lifted off the ground, and the world below became a blue and green canvas, with the Caribbean Sea shimmering like a jewel. He leaned his head back, still fixated on the window, while his mother closed her eyes to relax beside him. Andrew didn't know it yet, but this flight would be the most important of his life, and he was about to discover that his love for aviation wasn't just a hobby, it was a calling. The plane leveled smoothly at 35,000 feet, with the engines producing the continuous hum Andrew knew so well. He was captivated by the view outside, a vast, deep blue ocean stretching as far as his eyes could see. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the passengers relaxed. Some read, others chatted quietly, and many took advantage of the light turbulence as an excuse to nap. Andrew adjusted his seatbelt and reopened his book, focusing on a section detailing how autopilot works. "Did you know, Mom," he commented casually, "that autopilot can fly almost the entire route by itself? They only need humans for takeoff and landing." Claire smiled, but her attention was more on a travel magazine she was holding. "You should teach this stuff at school, Len. I bet a lot of people would find it interesting." He shrugged, immersed in the diagram. His passion for aviation was something he shared with few others. Most of his classmates preferred video games or sports. For Andrew, nothing compared to the thrill of understanding how such massive machines could conquer the skies. The plane's subtle vibrations shifted. Andrew noticed it first, an irregular oscillation. He looked out the window, trying to spot anything unusual. It was hard to tell, but he knew something felt different. The vibrations grew stronger, and the seatbelt sign dinged back on. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to enter an area of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. There is no cause for concern." Claire glanced at her son, expecting an explanation. "It's normal, Mom," he said. "We just need to get through the area. Sometimes it's just a patch of warm air." But inside, Andrew felt a slight unease. The pilot's tone seemed off. The vibrations intensified. The plane shook violently, spilling trays of drinks and prompting a few stifled screams from the passengers. Andrew gripped the armrests, trying to stay calm. "This is stronger than normal, isn't it?" Claire asked, her voice wavering. He didn't answer immediately. He was focused, his eyes fixed on the ceiling of the cabin, where a series of lights blinked in an irregular pattern. The aircraft's behavior felt unlike anything he had read about or experienced in simulators. Then came the silence. The plane stopped shaking suddenly, but the sound of the engine seemed muted. Andrew leaned forward, straining to hear better. "Mum, the engines—" He hesitated. "They're really low." Claire was alert. "Is that normal?" Before he could respond, another sound echoed through the cabin, a sharp, continuous alarm. The plane began to tilt forward, and Andrew felt his stomach drop as he realized they were losing altitude. The passengers, who had been quiet moments earlier, began murmuring anxiously. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, trying to calm the more nervous ones. Andrew glanced at the panel above his head. The seatbelt light flashed frantically, along with other alerts he hadn't seen before on any flight. He tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Something's wrong, really wrong." Claire cupped his face with her hands, trying to reassure him. "Andrew, it's okay, they know what they're doing." But Andrew wasn't so sure. He looked toward the cockpit. Why wasn't there any communication from the pilots? He knew that in situations like this, the captain should be updating passengers constantly. That's when he saw the flight attendant, the same one he'd impressed earlier, talking to another crew member near the cockpit door. Both looked tense, gesturing nervously. "I need to know what's going on," he murmured. Claire held him back. "Andrew, stay in your seat. This isn't your responsibility." But he knew he had to understand. Something was wrong, and all the clues were there, waiting for someone to piece them together. He fastened his seatbelt, waiting as the aircraft continued its slow descent. His eyes stayed fixed on the cockpit door, where he felt the answers to all this chaos were locked away. And soon he would make sure to find out what was behind it. The atmosphere in the cabin was tense, almost suffocating. The persistent alarm, refusing to stop, made passengers exchange fearful glances. Andrew gripped the armrests of his seat, his heart racing in sync with the plane's gradual forward tilt. He knew they were losing altitude, and fast. Claire tried to distract him, but Andrew's focus was locked on the scene ahead. The flight attendant gestured frantically near the cockpit door, while another held the emergency phone that connected directly to air traffic control. Something was terribly wrong. "Mom," Andrew said with a determined tone, "the pilots aren't responding. That's not normal." Claire tried to pull him closer, but he was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "Andrew, no, stay seated." "I need to know what's going on," he replied firmly, standing up and walking toward the front of the plane. Claire hesitated, but eventually followed her son, her heart pounding. The flight attendant saw him approaching and shook her head, trying to wave him off. "Kid, go back to your seat. Everything is under control." Andrew stopped but didn't back down. He pointed at the warning lights above the cabin. "If everything is under control, why are we losing altitude? Why won't the alarm stop? And why haven't we heard anything from the captain?" The flight attendant hesitated, clearly surprised by the clarity of the boy's questions. She cast a worried glance at her colleague, who was still trying to reach someone on the radio. "What's going on?" Andrew pressed. "Are the pilots okay?" The attendant sighed, finally giving in. "We haven't received any response from the cockpit, not through the intercom or the radio. We're trying to contact air traffic control." Claire caught up to Andrew, pulling him by the shoulder. "Len, go back to your seat. They know what they're doing." Andrew ignored his mother and looked directly at the flight attendant. "Can you open the door?" "That's impossible," she replied, her tone firm with the authority of protocol. "Security measures. Only authorized crew can access the cockpit." Andrew narrowed his eyes. "But what if they can't open it? What if something's happened to them? We're falling, and you need to find out what's going on." The flight attendant seemed ready to refuse again, but the other, still holding the phone, nodded in agreement. "He might be right. If the pilots are incapacitated, we need to check." With trembling hands, the attendant entered the security code on the keypad next to the door. After a few seconds, the electronic lock clicked audibly. Andrew felt his stomach tighten. Claire tried to hold him back, but he was already following the attendants inside. The cockpit was silent, except for the alarms blaring frantically across the control panels. Andrew saw the two pilots slumped in their seats, heads tilted to the side. They were breathing but completely unconscious. "Oh my God," the attendant murmured. Andrew stepped closer, quickly scanning the control panel. The flashing lights were a chaos of warnings: system failures, altitude loss, and depressurization. The yoke was unresponsive, with the autopilot seemingly overloaded. Claire stepped in behind him, holding her breath at the sight. "Andrew, get out of there now." But he didn't listen. His eyes were glued to the indicators on the panel. It was what he had spent hours studying in books and simulators. He knew what he was looking at, even though he had never imagined he'd see it in real life. "What's happening to the plane?" one of the attendants asked, almost breathless. Andrew pointed to one of the indicators. "We're descending fast. The autopilot is trying to compensate, but it won't hold much longer. We need to stabilize the plane or we'll hit the ocean." His words froze everyone in the cockpit. Claire grabbed his arm. "Andrew, this is not your responsibility. Get out of here." He turned, his eyes shining with a determination Claire had never seen before. "Mom, I know what to do. I know how to stabilize the plane. We don't have a choice." The flight attendant looked at Andrew, then at the unconscious pilots. Her face was a mix of hesitation and desperation. "Do you really know how to control this?" Andrew nodded, though fear was evident in his expression. "I've studied this. I know how to stabilize it. But I need you to contact air traffic control." Claire began to protest, but the attendant was already moving. "Then do it. Anything is better than crashing." Andrew slid into the co-pilot's seat, his small hands trembling as they gripped the yoke for the first time in his life. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the sweat dripping down his forehead. The radio crackled and a deep voice came through. "Flight 743, this is Miami Control. We've received your emergency signals. Who is in command?" Andrew pressed the intercom button with a shaky hand. "My name is Andrew Morgan. I'm just a kid, but I'm going to try to stabilize the plane." On the other end, the silence felt eternal. Then, the response came, firm and clear. "Understood, Andrew. We're with you. Let's save this plane together." Andrew took a deep breath. It was time to turn everything he'd learned into action. Andrew gripped the yoke, feeling the weight of responsibility in his hands. Everything he had studied, every diagram and simulation, now had to become real action. He looked at the control panels in front of him, illuminated by dozens of red and orange warning lights flashing urgently. The radio crackled again. "Andrew, this is Miami Control. We're going to guide you step by step. First, we need to stabilize the descent. Check the altimeter and adjust the nose of the aircraft to a slight upward angle. You can do this using the yoke. Take it slow, kid." He glanced at the altimeter. The numbers were dropping far too quickly. Taking a deep breath, Andrew pulled back on the yoke, feeling the resistance in the controls. The plane began to tilt slightly upward, but it brought a new challenge. A strong vibration shook the cabin violently. Claire, still standing by the cockpit door, gripped the frame tightly. "Is this normal? Why is it shaking like that?" "I think the air over the flaps is destabilized," Andrew responded, his eyes darting over the panel. "Control, I'm feeling heavy vibrations. Could this be structural failure?" The operator's voice on the radio was urgent but calm. "It might just be turbulence or an issue with the wing controls. Keep adjusting slowly." "How are the engines performing?" Andrew checked the indicators. "Both engines are running, but the power is fluctuating. The right engine seems weaker." "Understood. We'll address that later. For now, keep the nose level and reduce speed to minimize stress on the structure." Following the instructions, Andrew slowly adjusted the throttle. The plane began to respond, the descent stabilizing, but Andrew knew this was only the beginning. The panel still displayed other serious issues, including a flashing warning for the hydraulic system. "Control, we've got a hydraulic system problem," Andrew reported, his voice a mix of calm and nervousness. "The panel shows failures in the flaps and landing gear." The operator's voice carried a heavy tone. "That's serious, Andrew. The hydraulic system controls crucial parts of the aircraft, including the landing gear and flight controls. We'll need a contingency plan." Claire leaned in, gripping her son's shoulder. Does that mean we can't land? Andrew bit his lip. We can. It's just going to be a lot harder. Andrew, the operator called, we're going to guide you through using the emergency manual system to lower the landing gear, but it's going to take physical effort. Are you ready for that? He swallowed hard and nodded, knowing no one on the other side could see him. I'm ready. The flight attendant stepped closer, placing a hand on Andrew's shoulder. I'll help. What do we need to do? First, we fully stabilize the plane, he replied. Then we activate the manual mechanism. The radio continued guiding Andrew as he adjusted the controls. Every movement of the yoke felt like a test, but the boy managed to level the plane at an altitude of 10,000 feet. The constant engine noise and cabin vibrations eased slightly, bringing a brief moment of relief. Control, we're leveled at 10,000 feet, he announced, his voice steadier now. Well done, Andrew. Now, focus on the landing gear. The manual mechanism is near the co-pilot's seat. The flight attendant can help activate it. Andrew looked at the indicated console. A small metal lever was secured with a safety pin. He had read about this but never imagined he'd need to use it. That's it, he pointed out to the flight attendant, who was already kneeling by the console. It needs to be turned manually until the landing gear locks in place. She began to turn it, but the resistance was immense. Andrew temporarily engaged the autopilot, releasing the yoke to help her. Together they pulled and turned the lever with all their strength. Is it working? Claire asked, her voice trembling. Andrew, sweating, replied without looking back. I think so. Just a little more. Finally, a metallic clunk echoed through the plane. A green light on the panel lit up, indicating the landing gear was down and locked. Andrew let go of the lever, exhausted, as the flight attendant collapsed onto the floor, panting. Control, the landing gear is locked, Andrew announced, trying to catch his breath. Excellent work, Andrew. Now prepare for the final approach. We'll guide you to the nearest runway. Andrew returned to the yoke, adjusting the course according to the coordinates provided by air traffic control. The tension in the cabin was almost tangible. The boy knew every decision from this point on would be critical. Claire, tears in her eyes, briefly held her son's hand. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Andrew gave a brief smile, but kept his eyes on the instruments. We're not done yet, Mom. I still need to land this plane. As the Florida coastline appeared on the horizon, Andrew knew the hardest part was yet to come. He took a deep breath and prepared himself. The skies were clear now, but he could feel the weight of the hundreds of lives depending on him. And deep down, something inside him told him he could do this. After all, he'd been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he hadn't realized it. The Florida coastline shimmered in the distance, and the emergency runway at Miami Airport began to take shape on the horizon. The radio crackled, bringing the firm and reassuring voice of air traffic control. Andrew, you're approaching the air corridor for runway 9. We'll guide you through the final descent. How are the systems holding up? Andrew quickly checked the instruments. Despite the initial stabilization, the panel continued to flash warnings. The hydraulic systems were completely compromised, meaning he would need to manually adjust the flaps and spoilers to reduce speed for landing. The hydraulic system is still failing, Andrew reported. I'll have to adjust the flaps and spoilers manually. Understood, Andrew. This will be challenging, but we trust you. Stay calm and follow our instructions. He nodded, knowing they couldn't see him. His hands were steady on the yoke, but sweat dripped down his forehead. The flight attendant beside him, still catching her breath from the landing gear effort, remained calm. Claire stood silently, her trembling fingers clasped tightly together. Andrew, the controller said, we're detecting 20-knot crosswinds on the approach. This will require additional adjustments on the yoke to keep the plane aligned with the runway. Andrew swallowed hard. He knew what this meant. Crosswinds could push the plane off course during landing, making it harder to align the landing gear with the runway. It was something he had practiced in simulators, but never faced in real life. Understood, Control. I'll try to compensate with the rudder. With firm hands on the yoke, he began making small adjustments to keep the nose of the plane aligned. The radio stayed active, with clear and concise instructions coming through. Reduce speed to 140 knots on final approach. Manually adjust the flaps to 30 degrees. Andrew slowly turned the lever controlling the flaps. The resistance was immense, but he managed to move it to the indicated position. The aircraft responded, tilting slightly as the speed decreased. Now the runway was visible, illuminated by a line of lights that looked like markers on a path. Andrew adjusted the plane's angle, following the control tower's instructions. "Andrew, you're on final approach. Keep your alignment steady. Gradually reduce engine power when you're over the runway threshold." The weight of expectation was palpable. Andrew adjusted the rudder again to counteract the crosswinds and began reducing engine power, feeling the plane's response. The landing gear was locked, but he knew the impact could still strain the structure. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch. Andrew, however, was entirely focused. The plane descended rapidly but under control. As it neared the runway, Andrew adjusted the angle to ensure the main landing gear would touch down first. "Reduce speed to 120 knots, Control instructed. He gently pulled the yoke, aligning the plane with the runway. Then came the impact. The main landing gear struck the asphalt with a heavy thud, followed by the nose gear. The aircraft trembled violently but stayed aligned. Andrew engaged the manual brakes, feeling the resistance as he kept a firm grip on the yoke. The plane decelerated rapidly, but every second felt like an eternity. Finally, after nearly covering the entire length of the runway, the aircraft came to a stop. For a moment, silence filled the cabin. Then applause and cheers of relief erupted throughout the plane. Passengers cried, hugged one another, and raised their arms in celebration. Andrew leaned his forehead against the panel, exhausted but relieved. "Miami Control," he said, his voice trembling. "The aircraft is on the ground. We're safe." On the other end, the operator's voice was filled with emotion. "You did an incredible job, Andrew. Congratulations. You saved everyone on board." Claire stepped into the cockpit and embraced her son tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I knew you could do it," she whispered. Andrew smiled, exhausted but happy. As emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, Andrew finally let go of the yoke, his hands trembling with exhaustion. The flight attendant helped him stand, and together they walked to the main cabin, where passengers gave him a standing ovation. Andrew tried to hide his face, embarrassed by the attention, but his mother pulled him into a warm hug. "You're my hero, Andrew." And as the airplane door opened, letting in sunlight and the sound of emergency sirens, Andrew knew this was just the beginning of something much greater. The warm Florida breeze swept into the cabin as paramedics and emergency crews boarded the plane, checking on passengers and rushing to the cockpit to attend to the unconscious pilots. Andrew watched it all with a mix of relief and disbelief, still processing what had happened. He had landed the plane, him, a 12-year-old boy. The stream of passengers now descending the emergency staircase cast grateful glances toward Andrew. Many stopped to shake his hand or thank him with a simple "thank you." An elderly man placed a hand on his shoulder. "Son, you saved my life. You have a gift. Never forget that." Andrew simply nodded, speechless. He felt a surge of pride, but also the weight of what he had just done. In the cockpit, paramedics tended to the unconscious pilots. Claire, still beside her son, watched the scene with worried eyes. "What happened to them?" she asked one of the medics. "Both are showing signs of intoxication," the paramedic replied, fitting an oxygen mask on the captain. "We'll need to run more tests, but it seems something incapacitated them simultaneously." Andrew glanced at the pilots' seats. For the first time, he noticed trays of untouched food on the fold-out tables beside each of them. He frowned, recalling something he had read about safety protocols. "They're not supposed to eat the same meal," he commented. "It's a protocol to prevent both pilots from being affected by the same issue." The paramedic looked at him, impressed. "That's true. It's possible that protocol was ignored. We'll investigate." Claire placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "You've done everything you could, Len. Now it's up to them." Outside, Miami Airport was surrounded by emergency vehicles and a crowd of journalists. As Andrew descended the plane alongside Claire, he was met with a wave of camera flashes and rapid-fire questions. "How did you manage to land the plane? What was it like taking control? Do you want to be a pilot in the future?" Claire tried to shield him, but Andrew, still dazed, calmly answered one of the questions. "I just did what had to be done. I learned about planes because I love them. I never thought I'd use that knowledge for something like this. One of the reporters smiled. You're already a hero to everyone on that flight, Andrew. The word echoed in his mind. Hero. He didn't feel like one, just someone who did what they could in an impossible situation. Shortly after, Andrew was brought to a room in the terminal, where he was greeted by representatives of the airline. The company's CEO shook his hand firmly as a flight attendant draped a blanket over his shoulders. Andrew, what you accomplished today was extraordinary, the executive said. You saved hundreds of lives. On behalf of the airline, we want to express our gratitude. As a token of thanks, we're granting you and your mother lifetime passes on our flights. Claire smiled, but Andrew's focus was elsewhere. He looked at the CEO and asked, You're going to investigate what happened to the pilots, right? I want to make sure this never happens again. Of course, Andrew. We're already working on it. Your bravery will not be forgotten. That night, Andrew and Claire were in a hotel near the airport resting before heading home. Andrew sat by the window, gazing at the runway lights and watching planes take off and land, as he always did. Claire sat beside him. You were incredible today, Len. I've never been so proud. It was scary, Mom, he admitted. But at the same time, it was amazing. Being in the cockpit, controlling the plane, it felt right. Claire smiled, smoothing his hair. Maybe it's because it's what you were born to do. Andrew looked at her and then back at the lights on the horizon. For the first time, he was sure. Aviation wasn't just a hobby, it was his future. One day, he said, his eyes fixed on the stars, I'm going to be a real pilot. Not because I had to, but because I want to. The incident on Flight 743 became international news. Andrew Morgan was hailed as a hero, featured on TV shows and magazines. But despite his sudden fame, he stayed grounded, or, as he preferred to think, focused on the skies. In the years that followed, Andrew dedicated himself even more to his studies, diving deeper into aviation, and preparing to achieve his dream of becoming a professional pilot. The event that almost turned his life into a tragedy ended up defining his destiny, giving him a clear mission to make the skies a safer place for everyone. And so, the boy who saved a plane at 12 began his journey to becoming one of the world's best pilots, with the sky as his only limit. 3 weeks after the incident on Flight 743, Andrew still felt the weight of everything that had happened. Back in his small hometown, life seemed strangely normal, yet the world around him felt different. People who once barely noticed him now stopped him on the street to congratulate him. Neighbors brought gifts, and the school organized a ceremony in his honor. Andrew, however, remained focused on what truly mattered to him, his passion for aviation. In his room, surrounded by airplane posters and flight manuals, he spent hours revisiting everything he knew with a renewed sense of purpose. This time, it wasn't just curiosity. It was preparation for the future. On his first day back at school, Andrew was greeted by a hallway filled with applause. Classmates, teachers, and even janitorial staff were there to welcome him. A banner at the back of the classroom read, "Welcome back, Captain Andrew." "Captain?" Andrew muttered bashfully. His science teacher, Mr. Bradley, smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You earned that title, Andrew. It's not every day a 12-year-old saves hundreds of lives." During lunch, Andrew was bombarded with questions from his peers. Were you scared? Were the controls like the ones in simulators? What are you going to do next? Andrew answered them all patiently, but the last question lingered in his mind. One afternoon, while Andrew was running a flight simulation on his computer, Claire entered his room holding a letter. She looked excited. "Len, you got something from the airline," she said, handing him the envelope. Andrew opened it quickly and read it. It was a letter signed by the CEO, once again thanking him for his bravery and inviting him to visit the airline's headquarters. They wanted to introduce him to their pilots, engineers, and support teams, as well as give him a full tour of their flight simulators. Andrew looked at his mom, his eyes shining. "Can I go?" Claire smiled. "Of course you can. After what you did, they should hand you the keys to a plane." A few days later, Andrew and Claire traveled to the airline's headquarters. There he was welcomed like a celebrity. The CEO personally guided him through the building, introducing him to experienced pilots who greeted him with respect. "I've heard about you, Andrew," said a veteran captain. "Keep this up, and in a few years you'll be flying alongside me." But the most exciting moment came when Andrew was taken to one of the flight simulators used for official pilot training. He sat in the mock cockpit, surrounded by screens simulating a real aircraft. With the guidance of an instructor, he repeated the steps he had taken on Flight 743. "You've got natural talent," the instructor said, impressed. "And more importantly, you stay calm under pressure. That's rare, even among seasoned pilots." Andrew left the airline headquarters with an honorary certificate and the promise that when he was old enough, he would be welcome in their training program. Meanwhile, the investigation into the incident on Flight 743 was concluded. The pilots had consumed meals contaminated with a rare bacteria, which caused severe intoxication. The airline reviewed its protocols, reinforcing the rule that pilots must not consume the same meal during flights. Andrew followed the report with interest, feeling even more motivated to become a pilot. He knew that every detail mattered and that safety was the top priority. In the final scene, Andrew sat in his room holding a small model airplane he had received as a gift from the airline. He cradled it carefully, as if it were a treasure, while his mind wandered to the future. Claire entered the room and sat beside him. "Thinking about what's next?" she asked. He smiled, his eyes still fixed on the model. "Yeah, I know I have a long way to go, but I think I was born for this." Claire put her arm around her son. "You've got courage, Len, and when you love something this much, the sky is the limit." As the stars twinkled outside, Andrew lifted the model as if it were flying. His journey was just beginning, and he knew his final destination would be among the clouds, where he had always felt he belonged. The rising sun bathed the small airport in golden light as Andrew and Claire walked through the modest departure lounge. For most passengers, it was just another ordinary day, but for Andrew, this moment was anything but routine. He was about to take his first step toward his dream, an introductory flight lesson in a small Cessna 172 offered by a local flight school. "Nervous, Len?" Claire asked, watching her son adjust the strap of his backpack. He shook his head, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "No, I'm excited. I think I've never been more ready for something in my life." Claire smiled proudly. Since the incident on Flight 743, Andrew had become more determined and focused. And today, he would finally get a chance to put his knowledge into practice, this time with the safety of an instructor by his side. On the tarmac, Andrew was introduced to his instructor, Captain Stephen Harris, a middle-aged man with a warm smile and a firm voice. "So, you're the famous Andrew Morgan," Stephen said, shaking the boy's hand. "I've heard a lot about you. Ready to fly for real?" "More than ready," Andrew replied, trying to contain his excitement. Stephen chuckled. "Good attitude. Let's start with a pre-flight inspection. Every pilot needs to know their aircraft before taking off." Andrew followed Stephen around the Cessna, listening intently as he explained every detail of the aircraft, the flaps, the landing gear, the engine. Andrew already knew much of this from his studies, but hearing it directly from an experienced pilot and seeing it up close made the learning feel more real. "Now, into the cockpit," Stephen announced, gesturing to the plane's door. As he settled into the co-pilot's seat, Andrew felt a thrill of excitement. He placed his hands on the yoke, feeling an immediate connection to the machine. Stephen sat beside him and began explaining the instruments on the panel. "We'll take off today," Stephen said casually. "Just a quick circuit around the airport to get a feel for it. Nothing complicated." Andrew nodded, determined. He was ready. After receiving clearance from the tower, Stephen instructed Andrew to place his hands on the yoke and his feet on the pedals. He adjusted the throttle and guided the plane along the taxiway. "Okay, Andrew, your turn. Slowly push the throttle forward." Andrew obeyed, feeling the engine roar to life under his command. The plane began accelerating down the runway, and the gentle vibrations reminded him of the commercial flight weeks ago. This time, though, he wasn't just a passenger. He was part of the action. "Gently pull the yoke, and that's it, kid. We're airborne." The Cessna lifted off the ground, and Andrew felt the weightlessness of flight. He looked out the window, watching the airport and houses grow smaller. For the first time in weeks, he smiled effortlessly. The sky was open, inviting. For the next 20 minutes, Andrew followed Stephen's instructions, learning to make gentle turns, maintain altitude, and control speed. He was completely absorbed, each movement of the yoke bringing a sense of control and purpose. "You've got a knack for this," Stephen said after a long moment of silence. Not many people can keep the plane this steady on their first flight. The compliment fueled Andrew's passion. He knew he had much to learn, but this small beginning was all he needed to reinforce his confidence. After a smooth landing, guided by Stephen, Andrew climbed out of the Cessna with a sparkle in his eyes. Claire was waiting for him on the tarmac, waving excitedly. "Well?" she asked as he ran toward her. "It was amazing, Mom, better than I imagined." Claire hugged him tightly. "I knew you'd love it." As they walked back to the terminal, Stephen approached. "Andrew, you're a natural. Keep practicing, and you'll make an excellent pilot. Let me know when you're ready to fly again." Andrew shook Stephen's hand, grateful. He knew this wouldn't be his last flight. It was only the beginning. That night, in his room, Andrew wrote in his aviation journal. He recorded every detail of the flight, from the sound of the engine to the moment he felt the plane leave the ground. Closing the journal, he looked at the airplane model that still held a special place on his shelf. "I'm on the right path," he thought to himself. As the night sky sparkled outside, Andrew closed his eyes and allowed himself to dream. He knew his future was among the clouds, and that first step was just the beginning of a long and exciting journey.